Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're setting aside the usual chatter because we're exploring something, well, incredibly basic, something we all do constantly breathing.
Right. But it turns out it's maybe not so basic after all.
Exactly. The sources we've looked at suggest this automatic act is um, way more complex and has a huge impact on, your energy, sleep, even how you feel mentally.
Yeah, a surprising amount hinges on it.
So our mission today is to sort of cut through the detailed science and the history, pull out the really key stuff, what actually matters for breathing better and ultimately living healthier.
And one of the first things that jumps out from the material is this kind of provocative claim that modern humans, well, we've become the worst breathers in the animal kingdom.
Worst breathers.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty dramatic.
It does, yeah. But the argument is that changes in how we live, and especially, it seems, our diet, have literally changed our bodies, making it harder to breathe efficiently compared to, say, our ancestors or even other animals.
Okay, so that's a big starting point. Our modern life might actually be messing with our breathing.
That's the core idea, yeah.
So let's unpack that worst breathers idea. The sources, particularly that patient report you mentioned, they seem to blame our diets, soft foods, even starting with bottle feeding.
Precisely. It seems the lack of, well, hard chewing, vigorous chewing means our facial structure, our jaws, our airways, they just don't develop the way they maybe should.
So less chewing pressure means what?
Yeah.
Smaller jaws.
Kind of, yeah. Narrower dental arches, which then means less room up in the nasal passages. The sources draw a pretty direct line from things like early feeding habits to the chronic nasal congestion lots of people experience.
Which naturally leads us to the nose itself. You don't really think about it much.
Right, it just sits there.
But the material really hammers home how vital it is. It's not just a hole for air. It warms it, cleans it, humidifies it, even pressurizes it a bit, makes breathing through your nose way better than through your mouth.
Absolutely. And inside the nose, you've got these incredible structures, the turbinates. They're like intricate little scrolls or shells covered in tissue.
Like filters.
Exactly. Filters, heaters, humidifiers, all in one tiny space. One source, Nyack, calls the nose a silent warrior, just constantly working behind the scenes to prep the air, like the inside of a seashell protecting what's delicate inside.
That's a great image. So if the nose is this amazing piece of biological engineering, what happens when we bypass it, when we become mouth breathers?
Well, that's where it gets concerning. The sources talk about these experiments, kind of old now, with monkeys. They were forced to breathe through their mouths.
And what happened?
Their faces actually grew differently. Longer, downward growth, crowded teeth, narrower airways. It makes you think about the potential human parallels, doesn't it?
Definitely. So what are the real-world effects for people who chronically breathe through their mouths?
The list is pretty long according to these sources. Things like, obviously, snoring, sleep apnea, but also maybe more sinus infections, other respiratory issues.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then there were these Japanese studies mentioned, linking mouth breathing in rats to fewer brain cells. And in humans, potentially messing with oxygen flow to the prefrontal cortex.
Whoa, the prefrontal cortex. So potentially impacting things like focus, ADHD.
That's the suggested link, yeah. It's quite startling. It really suggests our bodies have a preferred operational mode, and mouth breathing is in it.
And you mentioned ancestors. The sources bring up ancient skulls.
Yeah, they show evidence of wider airways, more forward facial growth. The implication is they probably breathed much more easily through their noses than many of us do today.
Why the change? Was it just diet or environment too?
Probably a mix. The sources mention nose shape varying with climate, which is a clear adaptation. But the stark difference compared to modern populations really points towards more recent changes, likely linked to those dietary shifts we talked about.
Okay, now one of the most vivid parts of the material was the author's own experiment, blocking his nose, breathing only through his mouth for 10 days. That sounds awful.
It sounds truly miserable, yes, but incredibly revealing.
What did he find? What happened?
Almost immediately, negative effects started piling up. His heart rate went up, blood pressure went up, he started snoring heavily, developed sleep apnea.
In just 10 days?
Within 10 days, yeah. His heart rate variability, which is a marker of stress resilience, plummeted. He described feeling like he was suffocating during the night.
Wow. That really drives home how much the way we breathe matters, not just that we breathe.
Exactly. It's not just about volume.
So speaking of how the sources get into the science of energy production, aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. Can you break that down simply?
Sure. Think of aerobic respiration as your body's main super efficient engine. It uses oxygen to create lots of energy. Anaerobic is like a backup system. It works without much oxygen, gives you a quick burst, but it's inefficient and produces lactic acid.
That burning feeling when you exercise hard.
That's the one. So, nasal breathing, by providing a steadier, maybe more optimized oxygen supply, helps you stay in that efficient aerobic zone longer. Better endurance, less fatigue. Duard's research found people felt less exertion when breathing nasally during exercise.
Okay, so breathing properly through the nose actually helps performance. Makes sense.
Right. But here's another counterintuitive twist the sources bring up: carbon dioxide.
Yeah, CO2. We usually think of it just as waste gas we need to get rid of.
That's the common view, but it's actually crucial. There's something called the Bohr effect. Basically, you need a certain amount of CO2 in your blood for your hemoglobin to release oxygen effectively to your tissues and cells.
Wait, so having more CO2 helps get more oxygen where it needs to go?
In a way, yes, it facilitates the release. This is why just breathing faster or harder, or even breathing pure oxygen, like at those oxygen bars, doesn't automatically mean your cells get more oxygen. Henderson's work showed overbreathing can actually reduce oxygen delivery.
That's wild. So blowing off too much CO2 by overbreathing is actually counterproductive.
It can lead to a sort of relative suffocation at the cellular level, yeah.
Mind blown. Okay, so this brings us to techniques focused on breathing less or maybe just slower, like resonant breathing.
Exactly. Resonant or coherent breathing is about finding the sweet spot, usually around 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out. So about 5 or 6 breaths per minute.
And the benefit.
It seems to have a really powerful effect on the nervous system. It helps shift you towards the parasympathetic state, that's your rest and digest mode. Calming, reduces stress, anxiety, good for cardiovascular health.
It's interesting how the sources link that rhythm to things like praying the rosary or the pacing and some types of meditation and yoga.
Yeah, it suggests there's something quite fundamental about that slow, steady rhythm for our physiology.
Then there's Buteyko breathing. That seems even more focused on breathing less, right? Increasing CO2.
That's the core idea. Buteyko method is based on the premise that many of us chronically overbreathe relative to our actual metabolic needs, keeping our CO2 levels too low.
So you consciously try to breathe.
Lighter.
Less volume.
Essentially, yes. Gentle, reduced breathing to allow CO2 levels to normalize, which, paradoxically perhaps, helps with oxygen uptake because of the Bohr effect we just talked about.
And this has therapeutic uses.
The sources mention its use for asthma, for instance. Dr. Murray's research apparently showed symptom reduction correlating with increased CO2 levels in patients practicing Buteyko. And think about athletes like Zatupek doing hypoventilation training, intentionally reducing breath frequency during intense effort. Councilman, the swim coach, rediscovered similar principles later.
Wow. Okay, let's circle back to the diet connection. We mentioned soft foods at the start. How does the industrialization of food fit into this worst breathers picture?
It seems to be a major piece of the puzzle. The shift to highly processed, soft-farmed foods happened relatively quickly in human history, and this meant, well, much less chewing.
And less chewing over generations led to changes in facial structure.
That's the argument. Less mechanical stress means the jaws and related facial bones don't develop as robustly. Think narrower mouths, receding chins, less space for airways. Anthropological evidence from ancient burial sites shows skulls with much stronger jawlines and wider arches.
And Weston Price's work.
Right. He studied non-industrialized populations around the world in the early 20th century, found people eating traditional, often tougher, nutrient-dense diets had incredibly good dental health, wide arches, and seemed to have few breathing issues. Contrast that with those who adopted modern processed diets. The changes were often apparent in just one generation.
That's incredible. And it suggests that chewing isn't just for kids' development. Our bones can still change.
Apparently so. The sources emphasize that facial bones continue to remodel throughout life. Chewing provides that necessary stimulus, so the lack of vigorous chewing in modern life is a continuing factor.
Are there ways to simulate that?
Well, the sources mention devices like the Homeo Block, developed by Belfour. It's designed to mimic the forces of chewing and stimulate that kind of bone remodeling and potentially widen the airways, even in adults.
Yeah, interesting. But just as lack of stimulation is a problem, the sources also warn about too much intervention, like with nasal surgery, empty nose syndrome.
Yes, that's a really important cautionary tale. Sometimes surgery is intended to improve airflow by removing tissue, like parts of the turbinates can go too far.
And people feel like they can't breathe even though the passages are wide open.
Exactly. It's a paradoxical feeling of suffocation. It seems the nose needs those structures not just for space, but for sensing airflow, for creating the right resistance and turbulence. Nyack, who we mentioned earlier, works with patients suffering from this. It highlights how delicate the system really is.
That sounds awful. Shifting slightly. Let's talk orthodontics, usually just about straight teeth, right?
Well, historically, maybe not. The sources suggest early orthodontics, people like Kingsley and Robin, were actually very focused on widening the palate, expanding the jaws to improve the airway.
But modern practices.
Some modern approaches, particularly those involving extracting teeth or using headgear to retract the jaw, might inadvertently hinder that forward facial growth needed for optimal airways. Dentists like John and Mike New are quite vocal about this. They talk about oral posture, where your tongue rests, keeping your lips together, and how poor posture can contribute to what they call cranial dystrophy, basically underdeveloped facial structure affecting breathing.
So much can expect of facial structure and airways. Now, what about the other end of the spectrum? Not slow breathing, but intense, heavy breathing techniques, like Tumo or Sudarshan Kriya.
Right. These seem almost the opposite of Buteyko or resonant breathing. They involve short, powerful bursts of heavy breathing.
Why do that? Isn't that overbreathing?
It is, temporarily. The idea seems to be about hormesis using controlled stress to make the body stronger, more resilient. These techniques appear to deliberately activate the sympathetic nervous system, kind of like an exercise for your autonomic responses.
And there are measurable effects.
Apparently so. The work of Wim Hof, for example, suggests these practices can influence immune responses, body temperature regulation, things previously thought to be outside conscious control. The Harvard experiments mentioned seem to back this up.
So short bursts of stress breathing for resilience. How does that differ from something like holotropic breath work?
Holotropic breathwork involves prolonged hyperventilation. The sources suggest this can induce altered states of consciousness, possibly by significantly reducing blood flow to the brain due to the very low CO2 levels. So different mechanism, different goal compared to the short bursts of Tumo.
Okay, two very different approaches to intense breathing. It's clear breath is tied to our physical state, but also our emotional state, right?
Absolutely. It's a direct line to the autonomic nervous system. Slow, calm breathing activates the parasympathetic rest response. Fast, shallow breathing is linked to the sympathetic fight-or-flight response.
And the brain structures involved?
The amygdales are key. They're involved in processing fear and emotions, but they also have connections to breathing control centers. It's a two-way street. Your emotional state affects your breath, and your breath affects your emotional state.
Is that why some therapies focus on breath?
Potentially, yes. The sources mention Feinstein's research using controlled, brief inhalation of air with higher CO2 concentration as a potential way to treat anxiety and panic disorders. It seems counterintuitive, but it might work by kind of resetting or challenging the system's response.
Fascinating. Finally, the sources touch on older traditions, like the yogic concept of prana. How does that fit in?
Prana is often translated as life force, and in yogic traditions, breath is seen as the primary vehicle for prana. It's this idea that breath carries a vital energy that sustains us.
More than just oxygen and CO2.
From that perspective, yes. While modern science might not fully map onto it, you see interesting parallels. Swami Rama's documented ability to consciously control things like heart rate and body temperature through breath techniques is remarkable. And St. Georgi, the Nobel laureate, had theories about electron excitability being fundamental to life and health, which some see as echoing these ancient ideas about vital energy.
It's a lot to take in. So, wrapping up this deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways?
I think the biggest one is simply that how you breathe profoundly impacts almost everything. Your physical health, your energy, your sleep, your mood.
And nasal breathing seems to be the foundation.
Definitely. Prioritize breathing through your nose whenever possible. Understand that CO2 isn't the enemy. It's essential for getting oxygen where it needs it to go. Slow, mindful breathing is incredibly powerful for calming the nervous system.
But also, maybe occasional bursts of faster breathing could have benefits for resilience.
Potentially, yes, in controlled practices. And don't forget the long-term impact of diet and chewing on our actual physical ability to breathe well. It all connects.
It really does. So maybe a final thought for our listeners to consider.
Yeah, just think about this. Consciously paying attention to your breath, maybe even retraining it slightly, could be one of the simplest, most accessible, yet most powerful things you can do for your overall well-being.
So the question becomes, What's one small change you might explore in your own breathing habits after hearing all this?
Exactly. Food for thought.
And if you want to explore further, definitely look into some of the techniques like resonant breathing or Buteyko, maybe even nasal taking at night if you suspect mouth breathing. And check out the work of the researchers and practitioners we mentioned, Nestor, Nyack, the Muse, Hoff, Feinstein, lots more detail there.
Definitely worth looking into.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of breathing.